Hey, welcome back. So for this episode, I'm going to actually read chapter 9. We get what is it? A good idea goes horribly awry is what it's called. And in many ways, this is kind of the heart of the book. It's where they actually figure out how they're going to manage the kingdom since the king is dead. So in the previous episode, previous chapter, they got the civil war sorted in the kingdom. Um, Killed off a bunch of Mongol analogs, or actually convinced them to kill themselves off. And so now he's Minder and Kells and our hero are back at Mini, and they're going to get everything sorted. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with it. It's a bit long of a chapter, but like I said, it's kind of the core of the book in many ways. So, okay. So what did I say? Chapter 9. Good idea goes horribly awry. Our march back to Admini was strangely relaxing. The weather was fair and the road was in good repair, probably because we'd fixed it on the way down. All along our route, we could see the good citizens of the kingdom rebuilding their homes, digging drainage ditches and/or cesspits, and generally getting things back in order, all the while muttering about the idiocy of those responsible for the current circumstances. I certainly agreed with them, especially on the issue of proper public hygiene, which had been strongly reinforced by the Gagarin-inflicted stench, which still lingered on my gambeson, regardless of how often I washed it. We made good time, and for the first time since I'd left Sheepland, I actually began to relax and think that the worst of this crisis might be behind us. I know, right? It's as if I hadn't learned anything over the previous year, because if I had, I would have realized that any time things started going well, it was a prelude to an unforeseen catastrophe. If nothing else, the fact that I'd left a gaggle of nobles bickering at the gates of Admini when I'd gone to fight the Gugarin should have clued me in that there was probably a disaster of some sort awaiting me. The first sign I had that things weren't going well at Admini was when we arrived at the city walls and, once again, I smelled raw sewage. In this case, the stench wasn't coming from the city, as I'm fairly certain that Cyrene would have strung up anyone she found relieving themselves in the street or otherwise interfering with public hygiene. Instead, the smell was coming from a large encampment of brightly colored silk tents that had appeared outside of the walls. It was teeming with fashionably dressed folk wandering about, shrilly gossiping with each other or generally loitering around, being useless. We had nobles on our hands. Apparently, since someone, i.e., Cyrene and I, had resolved most of the immediate problems besetting the kingdom, they had decided to congregate around Admini and do what nobles do best, which is create more problems. Cyrene had the foresight to bar the gates, so they had plopped down wherever they found space and proceeded to do the usual noble things like crapping in their own drinking water and then complaining loudly when they developed gastrointestinal issues. I was sick and tired of smelling unsanitary people, so I decided this wouldn't do. By the divines, enough was enough. A person can only take so much after all. So I set about with the sheepish to sort out this mess, and soon they herded the sickly yet well-dressed gaggle of whining fops to one side of the road to get them out of the way. Once this was done, the sheepish quickly and efficiently tore down the original slapdash conglomeration of impractical tents and, after knocking some heads about, conscripted the usual mob of useless hangers-on that accompanied these sorts of gatherings. The camp followers were put to work digging cesspits and ditches to drain the by now quite soggy encampment. Of course, once the nobles saw actual work being done, they began to try to return to their former unsanitary lodgings to interfere, to the extent that I finally had to send Minrer and a detail of my house guard to keep them away. I patiently listened to, and then ignored, their whining until finally, after a few hours, the sheepish and their unwilling conscripts, who seemed somewhat mortified by the fact that they were actually accomplishing something, had managed to build a working drainage system. They also constructed a series of sheltered latrines located well away from the well that supplied the camp with its drinking water. And the tents were all repitched in a more orderly grid pattern, and waxed canvas tarps were spread to shelter them from the elements. Now, say what you will about silk, it looks nice, but it makes a very poor substitute for good old waxed canvas when it comes to keeping dry. At least the Baletian army had apparently decided to return home at some point during the last week or so, probably to avoid the possibility of having to fight the Gagarin, so I didn't have to keep an eye on them, too. I finally shepherded the last of the complainers back to their camp and sent Minner and my troops to build our own camp on the opposite side of the road where we could make sure the aristocrats kept their troublemaking to a minimum. Then Kells and I proceeded to the gate and politely knocked. The city guards, who had been watching the morning's entertainment with much amusement, opened a postern gate for us and escorted us through the bustling and clean city streets to the ornate marble palace that served as the administrative center of the kingdom. Kells and I were ushered into a small, windowless chamber located next to the main entrance. Its walls were lined with scrolls and books, and a small cast iron stove burned merrily in the corner. Cyrene was sitting quietly behind a plain oak desk strewn with papers, reading a thick ledger. She glanced up when we entered and waved away Kells and the guards, and then pointed silently at a wooden chair in front of her desk. Once the room was clear, I sat while Cyrene finished reading the page she was on, and then, with a tired sigh, she closed the book and set it aside, and then looked at me. I trust you sorted out the Grugarin, she asked, and those idiots at the city gates. Yes, I replied, the Gugarin managed to massacre themselves while trying to figure out who their leader was, so I don't think we'll be bothered by them for a decade or more. And I got the sheepish to clear out that cesspool of a camp at the gates. We've set up a basic drainage system and dug latrines, so I think even the local aristocracy can manage to keep things sanitary from now on. At least we won't have to worry about a major disease outbreak. Good, that's good, Cyrene said, rubbing her forehead. All we need on top of everything else is some boneheaded noble bringing the flux into the city. I noticed she looked tired, with dark circles under her pale blue eyes and fatigue lines on her face. I also noticed, as perhaps I had before, that she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Even now, after managing a civil war, multiple invasions, and the divines only knew what else, she was still radiant to me. Cyrene looked thoughtfully at me for a moment and then said, I'm glad you're back. I've had my hands full trying to keep Dyrannus from eloping with that arsling Prince Balric, stopping the aristocracy from leveling the city, which they seem particularly keen on for some reason, and stopping everybody else from torching the harvest, which makes even less sense than burning Admini. What do they expect to eat come winter? Thank the divines the lowland clans have taken to patrolling the central farmlands, and Alarcor has decided killing pirates is good business. Because if they hadn't, we'd be looking at a major famine next year. Thank you, I said. I'm happy to help, and sorry it took me so long to get here. I really want to have sex with you, I then helpfully added. The room got deathly quiet, and we stared at each other, me in slowly growing horror and her with astonishment. I mean, not right now, I stammered. Later, much later. You're busy right now, I know, and I don't think this desk would be particularly comfortable. I guess we could use a chair, but that probably wouldn't work either. You might have a bad back or something, right? We could drag a bed in here if you wanted to. I'm game if you are, is what I'm saying. Right now. For a moment, it seemed like I was floating over myself, looking down on a grinning, sweaty buffoon who kept babbling on, digging himself deeper with every word he said, and yet completely and utterly incapable of shutting up. It was like seeing a natural disaster slowly but inevitably unfold and not being able to do anything about it, except watch. It was awful. It was also fairly indicative of my social skills. Cyrene raised one finger, silencing me mid-babble. You need to stop talking. Now. I vigorously nodded and reached up with both hands to clamp my treacherous lips shut. I'm calling a meeting of the Grand Council tomorrow to decide the issue of succession, she continued, as if I hadn't just made a complete ass out of myself. Since you're here, and coincidentally have the largest army in the area, I'd like you to lead it and get the nobility to agree on who our new leader should be. I nodded again, still holding my lips firmly closed. Now, go and get some rest, she said, waving towards the door, and I'll keep everything lurching along while this gets resolved. I'll send a messenger to your camp tomorrow morning to bring you to the council chambers. I promptly got up and walked to the door. I turned around and opened my mouth to, hopefully, apologize when she held up her finger again. Lips closed, she said, already turning back to her books. I bowed and left, but not before noticing a small, amused smile on her lips. I gathered Kells from her post and went back to the camp, where I spent a sleepless night berating myself for being a fool and wondering how, yet again, I had gotten myself into the middle of another mess. Early the next morning, an annoyingly chipper young man arrived at my tent to take me to the Grand Council. To say I was less than enthused would have been the understatement of the century. I gathered up my usual entourage, told Minrir to bring reasoned response, and reminded Kells to check with me before killing anyone, and then we set off. When we arrived, we were ushered into the council chambers, vast domed room with tiered stone seats surrounded by disapproving-looking marble statues of various historical personages of varying importance. As an aside, it's always important to remove cushioning from seats in any sort of council or meeting chamber, because if aristocrats are comfortably seated, they talk. And while they talk, they don't accomplish anything except for coming up with new and inventive ways to make other people's lives more difficult. I found it's best to let them sit on uncomfortable chairs for an hour or so, just long enough to aggravate any back issues they might have, and then just send them off to a nearby dining area to gorge themselves on cheap pastries and salty finger foods. As an added bonus, if you make this a central part of your organization's operations, you can ensure regular turnover amongst your nobility due to the inevitable health issues that arise. Because there are few things worse than having to deal with an old aristocrat who has had decades to hone their obstructionist abilities. You can trust me on that. But I digress. Princess Diranus was sulking on a large throne at the far end of the chamber, and the rest of the room was packed full of impractically dressed nobles, loudly fawning, expounding, and, of course, complaining to each other. I noticed that Lembeck and Arzul had representatives on opposite sides of the chamber, shooting daggers at each other with their eyes while fondling actual daggers at their waists. The Beledians were also in attendance, although everybody pointedly ignored them, and they returned the favor with interest, looking down their noses from their seats on the balcony over the throne. Every major power surrounding the kingdom was represented, except for the Grugarin, because most of them were dead, and the Sertrani, because they didn't really care as long as the wool kept coming. Everyone in the room was obviously champing at the bit to get back to looting and burning as quickly as possible. It was an interesting assemblage, to say the least. And in other words, it was a disaster waiting to happen. I shared a glance with my companions, then walked to the throne. I gave a brief bow to Princess Diranus, which she pointedly ignored, turned to the room, and cleared my throat. Everyone kept yammering and glaring at each other. It was as if I didn't even exist. Minrir expressionlessly looked over the crowd for a moment. Then, in one smooth motion, he drew reasoned response and roared, "Silence, you useless, lick-spittling daubs! Lord Kaldor, slayer of the Sertrani Reavers and scourge of the Grugarin lords, wishes your attention. From here until Lord Kaldor says otherwise, anyone who speaks without raising their hand and getting permission from either Lord Kaldor, the respected Shade Kells, or myself will have their heads violently removed from their shoulders. This is your only warning." In the sudden shocked silence, Kells giggled and clapped her hands together delightedly. "I get to kill nobles," she gushed, grabbing my shoulder and squeezing it with excitement. "That's my favorite thing in the whole wide world." Then she left to wander amongst the seats, patting various pale aristocrats on the back and complimenting the ones wearing a particularly virulent color combinations on their, quote, well-intentioned, end quote, fashion sense. I cleared my throat again and said, yes, thank you, Minrir and Kells, for your thoughtfulness in getting us started. I We can't start yet, Diranus suddenly said. Balricky isn't here. I stood confused for a moment and quickly motioned to Kells that no, this interruption didn't mean that she could throttle the princess. Who is Balricky? I whispered to Minrir. I believe he's the Prince of Beled, he responded, and is officially referred to as Princess Diranus's Snookums. I see, I said, pondering and not liking the implications of adding a royal Snookums from a rival nation into the already volatile mix of personages in the chamber. Then, right on cue, a well-dressed blond young man strode into the chamber, breezily smiling at the silent crowd and seemingly oblivious to the tension in the air. "Snookums!" squealed Diranus as she jumped from the throne and ran to him. He laughed heartily and swept her off her feet, spinning her around as she giggled and simpered. "You're as beautiful as my mother, Dee Dee," he laughed as he set her down. They walked towards the throne, hand in hand, enraptured with each other and totally oblivious to everyone else in the room. "Dear divines," Minir muttered under his breath, "this is a God's damned disaster." I nodded in agreement and tried again. "We're here today to settle this question of succession because clearly things have gotten a little out of hand, what with the burning, looting, and general banditry and all. First, it is clear to me that Princess Diranus," I gestured back towards the throne where said princess was busy snuggling with her paramour, "she's the firstborn and only progeny of our late king, so she's the rightful heir." I looked back to see how she was taking the news that, yes, in fact, she was in charge, and saw with horror that she and Balric's canoodling had progressed to passionate kissing, notwithstanding that they were in front of a large, hostile audience. Ah, young love. There are few things more destructive in the natural world. "Yes, well then," I stammered, quickly turning back around. "I suppose we need to figure out who she's going to marry." Princess Diranus removed her tongue from Balric's mouth and announced defiantly, "I'm marrying my Snookums, and I will behead anyone who tells me I can't." "What, personally?" I asked, impressed despite myself. "No, you annoyingly silly person," she said. "I'll have one of the servants do it. Whoever does that sort of thing." She waved generally in the direction of the audience, presuming, I suppose, that the royal headsman was sitting somewhere in the crowd, just in case he or she would be called upon to practice their craft. "Well," I said reasonably, "perhaps you should figure that out before threatening anyone with beheading. What if you don't actually have a person that does that sort of thing? What then? You need to think these things through, your highness." She sulked back into Balric's lap and pouted to him. "Snookums, this man isn't giving me what I want." Balric, the divines bless his empty head, rallied and said, "I'll behead people for you, Dee Dee. Anyone you want." Diranus cooed, so I cleared my throat loudly before they were able to return to exploring each other's tonsils. "Your courage is commendable, young sir," I said dryly, "what with your extensive experience in fighting and beheading and such." I looked him over and contrasted his soft hands and complete lack of scars with, say, Minrir, whose scars even had scars. This convinced me that the only battlefield experience he had was managing to stay on his horse while the Beledian army marched to Admini. So let me throw this thought out there just because, I'm curious as to what you think about it. What happens if the person your young paramour wants to behead doesn't actually want to be beheaded? What then? The young lovers looked at each other in confusion. "Why would someone not want to do what I want them to?" the princess eventually asked. "Well, being beheaded isn't the sort of thing people tend to like doing, your exquisite, majestic presenceness," I said, stone-faced. Minrir was apparently having some sort of choking fit behind me, so he was no help, while Kells was looking at them with an intense fascination that I found somewhat alarming, especially since most of the people she looked at like that quickly ended up trying to swim in metal armor. There was silence from the throne as they tried to process this information. Then Balric brightened alarmingly and said, "I know, I'll just have my army attack anyone who doesn't want to let Dee Dee chop them up, and I'll fight them until they see reason." Oh, Snookums, you're so smart, Dyrannus cooed. He gazed back at her with a vacuous grin on his face, and I could see their faces starting to edge closer again, undoubtedly to start more inappropriate tonsil fondling. Kells came over to me and whispered loudly, "They don't have anything inside. Up here." She tapped her forehead. I nodded, because it's always wise to agree with Kells, especially when she's as right about something as she was here. "But nobody wants to be beheaded, Prince Balric," I said in exasperation. "What are you going to do? Fight everyone in this room and their armies?" With some effort, Balric stopped staring at Dyrannus for a moment, glanced around the room, and opened his mouth, undoubtedly to start a war with every major power in the region. The Beledian delegation belatedly realized what was happening, and I saw most of them leave off of their down nose staring and switch to eyes widening in alarm, but they were too far away to stop this developing catastrophe. So I stepped in. Now, don't get me wrong, a big part of me, the perversely curious part, wanted to sit back and see what would happen. But luckily, at this point, I was too tired and fed up to deal with yet another war. "Yes, I can certainly see how you would think that a good idea, Prince Balric," I said smoothly. "But I personally don't think you need to behead anyone over this. I can't see any reason why the two of you shouldn't be wed. Do you? And why wouldn't I allow the princess to marry her feckless tonsil friend? It had been done many times before, and allying Beled in the kingdom via royal matrimony was certainly a more efficient way to proceed than marching armies around burning things." "Wait, you mean getting married and such?" the suddenly pale Balric asked. "Yes!" Tyrannus shrieked, throwing her arms around her husband-to-be's neck and throttling him as affectionately as Kells did bandits. "I say yes!" Then the public canoodling began again, in earnest this time, although the prince seemed distinctly less enthusiastic about it this time around. I smiled tolerantly at them. Minwer continued choking on his stifled giggles, and Kells beamed at me. And for one brief, shining moment, I actually thought it would work. And then the entire chamber erupted. "Non-acceptable!" shrieked Margrave Bendioith, a small, rotund, arm-waving worthy who had decided that cramming himself into a skin-tight suit of purple silk was a good idea. He looked like an oversized, sweaty grape attempting to take flight. "Gratuitous! Gratuitous!" shouted Dame Monteron. I was somewhat confused about what she was trying to say here, but her wildly flailing cane seemed to indicate that she was not in favor of the match. "Intolerable tonsil fondling!" thundered the tiny Lord Belvish. Him, at least, I agreed with. The bedlam continued for a long while until my patient finally snapped. "Be quiet, you donkey-kissing mouth-breathers!" I roared. A shocked silence fell over the chamber as the aristocrats attempted to process what I had just said. Without giving them a chance to do so, I continued more quietly. "Now, someone raise their hand and tell me why, specifically, you do not approve of allowing our dear, dear Princess Dyrannus to wave the brave Prince Balric." And I should insert here that I probably should have added that Kells wasn't going around choking people just because they talked out of turn. Guess maybe a little oversight in the story there. After much muttering and shuffling, a noble named Lord Tavish finally raised his hand and said, "I don't like Beled. Never have, never will. I don't know why, but there it is. Also, we have plenty of good kingdom men for the princess to choose from. I myself, the sole heir to the lands and fortunes of the great House Tavish, am single and available." He preened as the mutters increased in volume around him. I stared speechlessly at him. Lord Tavish was a tall, pale man with pock-marked skin, a sizable belly, and a thin neck with a strangely prominent throat apple. He looked like an unhealthy subterranean ferret that had somehow managed to swallow a turnip. "Not so fast, sirrah!" shouted someone from the crowd. A small, pallid man with prominent buck teeth and weirdly protruding eyes waddled down the stairs and stood by Lord Tavish. This individual closely resembled a doughy beaver. "I am Lord Farron, and I rule the great House Farron. I hold lands all over the kingdom and am incidentally also available. This unleashed bedlam as various heirs and worthies of the great houses shouted at each other and stridently proclaimed their intention to court the princess. A few of the most available, i.e., wealthy, assembled at the foot of the throne and began loudly listing their qualifications, which seemed to mainly revolve around who their parents were and how much land they controlled. As I looked them over, I realized that although they were richly dressed in gold and silk, they were probably the most ill-favored group of men I had ever seen. Their teeth were either protruding, crooked, or missing altogether, and their skin tone ranged from pallid bloated to pallid pockmarked. And their eyes all looked odd, either set slightly too closely together or slightly too far apart. And not a single one of them appeared to have exercised, or bathed in some cases, for years. They didn't seem particularly bright either, because their wooing consisted entirely of listing their lands and lineage more loudly than their rivals. "What's wrong with them?" I whispered to Minrir. "They all look off." "They're heirs of the great houses," he replied softly. "It means they only marry aristocrats from other great houses. They're all quite inbred, I'm afraid." I looked at them with amazement. These are the blue bloods that represent the best of the kingdom? They all look like they spent several generations living in the hills, sleeping with their sisters and hobnobbing with goats. "Well, that's pretty much accurate," Minrir said. I glanced back at the princess and Balric. Neither of them looked pleased, and in fact, Diranus was rapidly getting that "I need to execute someone" look on her face. Not that I could blame her in this case. Something needed to be done, and quickly, before most of the great houses became formerly great houses. I looked at Kells and nodded slightly. She beamed at me and then turned to the mob of misshapen inbreds that were gesticulating and whining in front of the throne, totally oblivious to the danger they were in. Kells clapped her hands sharply and said, "Quiet, everyone. Please be quiet." Of course they ignored her, so she reached out and began choking Lord Farron, who quickly turned an alarming shade of purple. "I need you to listen," Kells continued, ignoring the pudgy lord's increasingly desperate wriggling, "because if you don't, I'll get to choke you all. Lord Kaldor said I could." Well, that finally shut them up, and, after I nodded meaningfully at Lord Farron, Kells shrugged apologetically and let him go. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, and promptly scuttled back to his seat. Apparently, momentarily losing what little oxygen usually reached his brain had cooled his ardor somewhat. "Listen, I'm sure you're all great fellows and all, but since Princess Diana is the heir, we have no say in whom she can or can't marry." "Who says that?" shouted one of the inbreds. "I do," I said grimly, "and so does my army. So if you don't like it, you can go out and get your own army, and then we'll sort this out the old-fashioned way." Silence greeted this, and then slowly and reluctantly the would-be paramours shuffled back to their seats. I'm not sure that they realized the futility of taking on the sheepish with whatever untrained mob they managed to round up. Instead, I think what cooled their ardor more than anything was the belated realization that raising an army was a lot of work, and the idea of having to engage in actual labor was anathema to them. "Great," I said. "I'm so glad we all agree." Diranic and Balric beamed at each other. I turned to them. "Now, would you both like to govern or just be figureheads?" They frowned at me. "What does this governing involve?" Balric eventually asked. "Well, it means you tax things, maintain roads, build sewers, things of that nature," I responded. "Oh," he said, glancing at Diranus. "Do we want to do that, Dee Dee?" "I don't, Snookums," she pouted. "Don't we have people that can take care of all that? It sounds boring. I just want to cuddle." Ulrich pondered this for a long moment, and then he made what was probably the most brilliant decision of his entire life. "We'd like to be figureheads," he announced proudly. And then he returned to his young bride and began, "Well, at this point you probably know what they went back to doing." I rubbed my head in exhaustion. I was working on a headache of epic proportions, and it seemed as if every problem that I resolved only led to another one. This must be what Cyrene has to deal with every day, I thought. I can't understand how she does it. straightened my shoulders, and then said, "Okay, then, who should lead?" Judging from the increasing frequency of lip-smacking sounds from behind me, I thought it unlikely that the newly betrothed would be interested in sharing their insights. But, as per usual, in the chamber their ill-reasoned opinions were hardly in short supply. Nearly every noble in the room instantly stood up and began loudly proclaiming their nearly non-existent, as far as I could tell, leadership qualities, which ranged from having a good bit of land to having a lot of money to having a good bit of both. I looked around in despair. I wouldn't trust most of these people to figure out how to dress themselves, much less administer the kingdom. I needed to find some way to winnow the mob down and hopefully build consensus, lest we revert back to the usual burning and looting. And then I hit on it. We could vote. I clapped my hands for silence, and, for a wonder, the room actually quieted without Minner or Kells having to intervene. Now we have so many distinguished members here that choosing one of you for a regent is simply beyond me, I said. But never fear. You are all so well qualified that I think you should choose a regent amongst yourselves. Just do your usual thing, eat, talk, mingle, until one of you has the most votes, and then that person will become regent. It's simple. Kells and Minrir looked at me as if I were insane, and in retrospect, I probably was. And then the murmuring began, and I could see the idea take hold. After all, who else was better able to decide who to lead but the leaders? Yes, they took to the idea with the fervor of that only people who haven't actually led before could. They immediately began circulating amongst themselves, talking and gossiping and hobnobbing in typical noble fashion. It was amazing. It was horrifying. The first snag hit within 10 minutes. "How will we know who has the most votes?" shouted someone from the crowd. I was momentarily stumped, and then my eyes lit upon the huge tapestry hanging behind the throne. It was done by the great artist Monrose and depicted the discovery, stalking of, and eventual slaying of the great Drake Sawdoff in the early days of the kingdom. The first panel depicted a small group of armored figures harassing the reptile, with predictable results, and continued on with larger and larger groups poking an ever more and more irritated-looking dragon until it ended with an exhausted Sawdoff finally giving up and letting a veritable horde of sword-wielding maniacs cut off its head. It was called Killing the Lizard and was widely considered Monross's best work. I personally hated it, which is probably where my inspiration came from. "Minrir," I shouted, "take down that tapestry and cut it into strips. Make sure each strip is the same color. Kells, you help them and put the strips into similarly colored piles. Everyone else, if you want to be considered for the position of regent of the kingdom, grab a strip of an unclaimed color and tie it around your arm. If you want to give someone your backing, simply choose a strip of their color and tie it to your wrist. Once everyone who wants to be regent has been identified and we're ready to vote, I'll have the candidates come up to the front of the room and the rest of you can add your strip to the appropriate pile in front of them. After we're done, I'll count up the strips and whoever gets the most is regent. It's simple." It wasn't simple. The chaos and confusion that this plan created was both instantaneous and catastrophic. Conversations roared, people milled, everyone gesticulated wildly, and various colored bands appeared and disappeared with chaotic regularity. It was an unmitigated disaster. The process started smoothly enough, with Minner and Kells efficiently tearing down the tapestry and cutting it into hundreds of strips. Luckily, Monrose didn't skimp on the dyes, or he might have run out of colors. And then things began to go awry. Some nobles decided to run for regent and then backed out to give their support to a friend, only to reverse their decision when their erstwhile friend slighted them. Others couldn't decide who to vote for, so they took to tying so many strips to their wrists that they soon began to resemble some sort of garish, flightless bird. Lembeck and Arzul decided they should get a say in who ran the kingdom and began handing out colored strips left and right to the more feckless nobles, which, of course, led Beled to do the same. Debates raged, insults flew, and a few ineffectual duels were fought. Now, all of this paled in significance to what happened when Dyrannus found out that Balric was in favor of putting the Arzuli representative, a cunning rat-like man named Nervous, in charge of the kingdom. You did what? She shrieked, clawing at his embroidered doublet like an enraged banshee. I told you I hated the Arzuli. They don't like cats, especially that evil man Nervous. Dee Dee, calm down, please, he said, desperately trying to hide behind the throne. I didn't mean it. He tricked me. He said I was smart, and he gave me a brooch. He held up a silver piece of jewelry with Arzuli rule prominently emblazoned on it. And then Dionysus instantly calmed down, which was one of the very few times I've seen the phrase calm down actually work. Oh, Snookums, she cooed. You're so smart, you don't need Nervous to tell you what to do. Now, I didn't follow the logic, but it worked because the young couple instantly resumed staring into each other's eyes, apparently enraptured by their scintillating debating technique. Before they could go back to actively trying to stick their tongues down each other's throats, I managed to convince them to go back to the royal chambers and leave the work to their lessers. Removing that volatile element from the already explosive situation in the chamber was one of the very few things I managed to accomplish that morning. 12 hours later, we were all exhausted, and the kingdom was, apparently, going to be run by a coalition of Arzul, Lembeck, and an even dozen representatives of the great houses. And then, of course, most of the nobility hadn't realized that Arzul and Lembeck were even trying to gain the regency. So this led to even more loud recriminations and ineffectual dueling before I was forced to send Kells and Minrer into the crowd to settle everyone down. Now, I don't know how they could have missed it, given that Arzuli and the Lembeccan candidates had been proudly parading around in their respective colors for hours, which everyone with eyes could easily see. But I digress. I was sitting on the throne, slumped in despair, when the council room doors boomed open and Cyrene walked in. Her sharp glance quickly silenced the chattering mob, and then she turned to me. So, have you sorted out the succession yet? Sort of, I gulped, jumping guiltily off the throne. We've managed to convince everyone that Princess Dyrannus and Prince Balric can get married. But the royal couple doesn't actually want to do anything beyond that. So now we're trying to figure out who the regent will be. Brilliant idea suddenly sprung into my head. I was astonished I hadn't thought of it earlier, actually. Say, Cyrene, you like doing things, and no, she said, cutting me off. I'm not foolish enough to be the official regent. And besides, according to the kingdom law, the position must be held by a noble, which I thankfully am not. How are you trying to choose the regent? And why is killing the lizard in pieces all over the floor? Oh, I said, disappointedly slumping back onto the throne. Well, we're voting, and I decided we should use a tapestry as a way of tabulating the results. Voting? Cyrene replied. Interesting. She studied me with her cool blue eyes for a moment, then turned to the silent nobility and said, Who here wants to be regent? Raise your hands. Roughly one-third of the chamber tentatively raised their hands, so she continued. Who here is actually a citizen of the kingdom and realizes that being regent will require you to work? That means it will definitely cut into your falconing, show horsing, feasting, and gossiping times. So please bow out now if you're not willing to make that commitment. Most of the hands quickly went down, including the sulking Arzuli and Lembeccan candidates. But a dozen hardy souls still had their hands raised. Who here knows how important a sewer is and is willing to ensure that the kingdom keeps its infrastructure up to date? Cyrene continued relentlessly. Most of the hands eventually dropped, except for one frail, toothless old hag from a minor house on the eastern border. Cyrene studied her with compassion for a moment, then said, And who knows where they are right now? The old noble slowly lowered her hand. Cyrene looked around the chamber and muttered, As I thought. And then she looked over at me, slumped miserably on the most uncomfortable chair in the room. Lord Matthias, she said, Do you realize how important the sewer is? Of course, I replied. You need a good system to keep everyone healthy and from smelling awful. And everyone knows defecating in your drinking water isn't a good idea. Why? She didn't answer me. Instead, turning to the audience, it is clear to me that there is only one person in this room qualified to be regent. They have not only proven themselves in battle, but in one short year they have turned what was once a backward province into one of the richest in the kingdom. They are brave, rich, well read, and they understand the importance of good infrastructure in maintaining the well being of society. Who? I said, jumping up and excitedly looking around the room. Did they get any votes? Where are they? And why would anyone like that be stupid enough to want to be the regent? I continued scanning the audience, but no one stood, so I turned back to Cyrene in confusion. And then, with dawning horror, I saw it. Minir was looking at me with pity, and Kells actually had tears in her eyes as she choked back a sob. But Cyrene, well, she just looked at me calmly, waiting. Dear Divines, no, I said with horror. But she simply stood at the foot of the throne until I slumped back, defeated. When I did that, she turned to the audience and shouted, May I present Lord Matthias, the first of House Kaldor, Regent of the Kingdom? And the room erupted with relieved cheers. And that, dear readers, is another example of a good idea going horribly, horribly awry. And that's that. Yeah, I like that chapter. That might be my favorite chapter of the book. Um, I do want to say a little bit about voting. I'm actually a fan of voting, a huge fan, which maybe you didn't get from that how things ended up. Um, I think democracy is really, for us, it's flaws, and granted, it's a chaotic, messy system, but it's the best one out there because it's the only one that's actually just. It's the only one where the majority of the citizenry actually get the government they deserve. So if you vote in some moron, again, not talking current politics, we've regularly elected morons in the United States. Uh, you get moronic government. I'll use El Salvador as an example. They had a huge gang problem and they elected a dictator. And he's in and he fixed the problem, but he's not leaving. So, you know, they kind of got that on themselves, unfortunately. I hope it sorts itself out with not too much bloodshed, but I kind of doubt that's going to happen. So anyway, just to clarify that, I'm a huge fan of democracy and justice, the justice that democracy brings to the majority of the citizens. Or it's really the only system out there that does that. So with that, I'm probably going to try recording a couple more sessions this week just so I can wrap the book up. So I will cut this short. It's getting a bit long, and get us another chapter in tomorrow. So have a good day.